In this video reading, I want to talk about Uranus turning retrograde, and I also want to talk about the Pisces Lunar Eclipse. Uranus turned retrograde on September 6th at 12:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I'm recording this on September 7th, so it happened yesterday. And then the Pisces Lunar Eclipse is happening today at September 7th, on September 7th at 6:12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So if you look at these charts, it's really interesting. They're very similar, except there's a lot more going on in this chart than in this chart. I'm sorry about going back and forth. This is really interesting to me. I'll talk about it in a second, but I just want to just mention some themes. I'm not sure which of these I'm going to cover or to what depth or length I'm going to cover them, but the general themes that have come up for me as I've looked at this chart are the idea of love as a muscle, the idea of maturing perhaps in our relationship with AI, having a moment of understanding and perhaps that evolving our relationship with AI. And I think of that more as on an individual level, but I'm not sure, it could be happening at a larger level than that. And then I think about this idea of giving and taking within the context of what I would call strangership societies. So how have we organized our societies? Have we organized them around giving and receiving, or have we organized them around the idea of taking? I think that's an interesting theme that's in this chart. And then this idea that sort of speaks more to the more challenging energies of our time, although the giving and taking does too, but this idea of a dragnet, this sense of, feeling like things are kind of closing in around and perhaps we're all being picked up into a dragnet. That came through for me. I'm not sure how much I'm going to talk about that. But what I do in these readings is I have these ideas when I come to a reading, and it doesn't matter how structured I get or anything. What ends up happening is what comes out is what comes out. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, but those were themes that I thought about. The first thing I want to talk about is just, it's really interesting to see that there's a lot going on here, and then a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it falls away. And this brings to mind to me this idea of apoptosis. And before I even say that, when I see a chart with this, with a lot of things, a lot of aspects going all which way, every which way, I think of the idea of fascia in the human body. And if you look at some images of fascia, they'll have, strands, fibers going every which way. And that's actually how they're designed as I understand it. And the purpose of fascia is to support the body. So when I look at a chart like this, I think, wow, there's a lot of support for whatever is happening here. Uranus turning retrograde is a big event. So we could say there's a lot of support for this event happening. And then the next day, it falls away. And that brings up the idea of apoptosis, this idea of programmed cell death, that at certain points in our biological process, parts of our body, cells will literally, they're programmed to die. And that is because it's part of the creation process. So if you think about the webbing, when we're in the womb, our hands start with no defined fingers and toes. There's webbing that connects everything together. And at some point in our development, that webbing falls away. That's programmed cell death, apoptosis. And the purpose of that is so that now we have these fingers. It's part of the creative process. You can almost think about it too. It just occurred to me now as I was talking. In the forest, my understanding is that fungus, part of the role of fungus is to keep rejuvenating the forest by breaking down parts of it. So it will sort of break down parts of the forest, and those will turn into meadows, and that process is part of the life cycle of the forest. It keeps it rejuvenated and renewed. So that's an interesting idea I hadn't thought about until now. Pluto would relate to the idea of fungus, and there's a lot of Plutonian energy going on right now, so that's kind of interesting to think about. It's part of the evolutionary process, we could say. And then if you think about when we get older, my understanding is there comes a point in our development, and it may happen more than once, I don't know, but we'll have all these neural connections made, and then there'll be a time where they just fall away. And it's not because there's a problem, it's because I believe it's because we reach a point in our development where perhaps we have more clarity about who we are, and we don't need all those connections. The connections that remain are the ones that are perhaps what we've used, and perhaps more about who we are. But of course, who we are in part depends on what we've practiced. So that's an interesting thing to bring into this, which I'll talk about. And I've talked a lot about this. Virgo is the energy of the year, in my opinion, and it is this idea of practice and skill development. So that's why I've talked about it a lot. And we have the sun in both these charts in Virgo. So anyway, that's one of the first things. That goes along with, we see these aspect patterns. We see this, we see this one aspect pattern. We see this T-square that has Jupiter in Cancer at the base, at the focal point, and then Mars and Libra opposed Ceres in Aries. And Mars rules Ceres. And Mars in Libra is not in its strength. However, Libra is about rebalancing. So we can think about the idea of rebalancing the masculine energy. We have created a society where we're all kind of running, we're on, our lights are on, we are on a lot, and we don't get enough rest. And so that can lead to burnout. That would be a Mars expression. And so it's rebalancing. That's one area where we might rebalance, but it's really rebalancing in regard to this Mars energy, this assertion energy. And we can think in terms of taking. That's something that came to mind for me. So the story of Ceres is her daughter, Persephone, gets taken by Pluto, gets abducted by Pluto. Ceres is upset, in part because her daughter is gone, but in part because nobody bothered to consult her. So Pluto took Persephone because Zeus, the lead god, he goes to Zeus or something, and Zeus says, yeah, sure, go ahead and take her. So Ceres is upset because Zeus didn't consult her. And of course she's grieving because her daughter's gone, but it's more complex than that. But nobody in the story seems to be thinking about what did Persephone want? What did Persephone think about it? What? So it's sort of like we're making assumptions about boundaries and who has the right to make decisions for and about and whatever who. And it's based on this idea of taking. Pluto doesn't bother to talk to Persephone to see what she wants. He's just like, I want this, and so he just gets permission to go ahead and take. So it's kind of a messed up way of doing relationships, right? And I think that with Jupiter here at the focal point of this T-square, Cancer has to do with this idea of our lineages, and Jupiter has to do with this idea of our philosophies, our beliefs, our religions, that sort of thing. So it's almost like the lineages that have been passed down from generation to generation perhaps are based more on this idea of taking and ownership than they are on this idea of giving and receiving and respecting and that sort of thing. So that's something I see here, and perhaps there's a rebalancing of this Mars energy, that rather than asserting oneself into what one wants, one starts to understand there's another person here. In the last video, I talked a lot about the 2-year-old energy. The 2-year-old is just learning to exercise its will. It's recognizing it's separate, and it hasn't yet learned the art of it. It doesn't yet understand this person is separate from me, and just because I want something from that person doesn't mean I get to have it. So the 2-year-old energy is about learning how to balance our wills and desires while respecting the boundaries of the other, and also while tending to our own boundaries. And so perhaps there's a rebalancing of boundaries, and perhaps that will happen at a larger societal level. Jupiter is one of the social planets. So that may be part of what this is about. There's this. You can think about a T-square as, and in some ways, as a pivot point. That there's some pivot happening, and perhaps that's part of what that pivot is. This rebalancing, and to the extent that we're each understanding, recognizing within ourselves where we have internalized this idea that taking is okay, then the more societal wide level, that can actually shift. That's the way that I think about it. There's another interesting thing going on here. There is, I put this here, this is not a mistake, this is just to remind me that Lilith is here. So Lilith is around here at about 18 degrees of Scorpio, and with her here, that forms a grand trine with the North Node at 18 degrees of Pisces and Jupiter at 18 degrees of Cancer. And the clicking is my Instant Pot. I've been in the habit of starting my Instant Pot and then doing these videos, so you hear this clicking. I apologize. But anyway, and it's an interesting habit, I guess. I'll have to think about that within the context of this reading, which we'll get to. Okay. So this is a partile grand trine. Everything's in 18 degrees. So that's interesting in itself. It's tight. And it intersects with Jupiter here. So Jupiter, we could say, a grand trine is they're all equal sides, so there is no really point. There are 3 points to it, but there's no focal point to it. But because it's intersecting with Jupiter and Cancer here at the focal point of this T-square, we can say that this is the driver, perhaps, of the energy. So a grand trine is just this flow of energy, and it's just, I think of it as like a circuit of energy, and it's just flowing and flowing and flowing. And what's flowing depends on what's been created. So if it's positive, what's been created is positive and loving and caring, that's what's flowing. If what's been created is negative and harmful and etc., that's what's flowing. In our society, perhaps the balance has been more on the side of taking, so that's what's flowing. And perhaps there's an opportunity here to change that dynamic. So that with the T-square here, so we have the flow, it's what's flowing, but with the T-square, there's an opportunity to perhaps torque that so that we can change the dynamic, so it's no longer, so that we each learn to shift more and more to giving and receiving rather than taking and assuming, having a right to things, that sort of thing. So I've used this in the past, and I think it's a really helpful metaphor, a way to think about it. When I was a kid, we would get in a pool, and we would all go in the same direction around the edges, and we would get this current going, and it would get it going really, really strong. And then we'd all change directions, and we'd go in the other direction. And it was really hard to go in the other direction, but we understood what was happening, so we kept doing it. And eventually the circuit changed and it started getting easier in that other direction. And you can do this. You don't have to have a pool and other people. You can just get a big bucket of water, and you can get a stick and you can stir that water in one direction. This is done in what's the name? There's a kind of farming that's name of it is escaping me. It's by something, BI something. For whatever reason, bioenergetics or. I'm not thinking about I can't think of what the name is right now. But anyway, they create these sprays that they spray on the plants, and to make those sprays, they put something in water, a bucket of water, and then they do this stirring thing. For me, that feels like what they're doing is successing it in a certain way, and they're creating a homeopathic spray, but it's probably a little bit different. Anyway. So they have a stick and they stir the water in one direction, and they do it, I believe, until they create a nice, like a strong vortex, and then they change the direction they're stirring it in, and they do that until another vortex is created in the other direction, and then they change the direction again, and they keep doing that, and they do that for a while. And I did this for a while because I didn't do, not because I was doing any farming. I lived in an apartment, second floor apartment in the city with no plants around or anything. But I saw that demonstrated. I was like, I need to do that. And it's for me, I experienced it as a very calming meditative practice. Anyway, what the same thing happens when you stir in one direction. It gets really easier and easier and easier to stir in that direction, but then you change directions. It's really hard, but you keep going because you understand what's happening, and you understand that if you keep going, it will get easier to do. In our lives, we get patterns going. We engage in daily practices, Virgo, that create patterns, that create circuits of energy, that create currents of energy that go in a certain direction. And if those are healthy patterns, Virgo health, that's great. They serve us. But if they're unhealthy patterns, they don't serve us. And if we want to feel better and feel healthier, feel better mentally and all that kind of stuff, then we need to figure out ways. We need to start changing patterns. And I'm saying this to myself as much as to almost more than I am to you, because I have some, my tendency has been negative mental patterns and things like that. And obviously I have illness that's been going on for a long time. So, and my illness was, the seed of that illness was that I didn't take good care of myself for a long time. Because I didn't understand how to, frankly. But anyway, so for me, it's been a process of learning how to take care of myself, and that continues. But when we say take care of ourselves, that happens on all different levels. There's the physical body, what we're putting into our body, etc., what we're exposing our body to. And then there's the mental patterns, and then there's the emotional patterns, and then there's the relationship patterns. So it's happening at all sorts of different levels. And for me, the way that I would think about it is you just focus on one level and you work to change that level, and then maybe you focus on another level and you work to change something in that level. So anyway, to the extent that we have patterns that are working against us, well, that's the flow that's flowing. And with Cancer involved here in this grand trine, part of those patterns are lineage patterns. And to the extent that we can make those conscious, then we have an opportunity to make some changes. The North Node in Pisces talks about consciousness, and it talks about the evolutionary direction of our soul development is towards becoming more conscious. And the more conscious we can become of our patterns, the more we can change them. And the challenge is that when in a grand trine, the challenge is that when you start to change a pattern, metaphorically, if you think about the water imagery, you create turbulence. And it's difficult at the beginning to stay with those changes because the turbulence is there. And I think part of what makes it difficult is we don't understand why it's not going well initially. And so if we understand that, perhaps that can help us as we work to change patterns. And the other idea here is the idea of the building muscles. Part of what makes changing patterns hard is those muscles, those literal or metaphorical muscles haven't been built yet. And that can be hard to understand if you don't understand what that actually means in actual practice. So again, we have North Node in Pisces. That is, Pisces does represent love, unconditional love. So building the muscle of love, and part of building that muscle of love involves what we engage in, the practices we engage in. Opposite of Pisces is Virgo. They work in tandem, they work together. We want our practices to be our way of living love and expressing love. So are the practices we're engaged in self-loving, or are they not? Are our mental patterns self-loving, or are they not? So that strikes me as really relevant with regard to this Uranus turning retrograde. In terms of Uranus and Gemini, well, actually, let me do one more thing. There's also this quindecile, and I believe the technical pronunciation is quindecile, but I say quindecile. I prefer that pronunciation. So there's this quindecile between Pluto, the soul, and Jupiter. So in evolutionary astrology, it's not the primary way I practice, but it's hugely influential in how I think about things. Pluto is the soul, and you start the reading of a chart by looking at Pluto, and that is in Aquarius. So it's our individuated evolution, and Pluto as the soul is about our evolution as a soul, and it's about the choices and commitments we make. All of that and the desires that we have. Pluto is where our desires reside, I suppose, from an evolutionary astrology perspective. And so that leads to choices and commitments and things like that. But anyway, in Aquarius, it's talking about our individuated evolution, and it's talking about our evolution as a humanity as a whole. And the North Node represents so Pluto is the soul in the now. The North Node represents the evolutionary trajectory of the soul. The soul, where is the soul evolving towards? And the South Node represents the evolutionary foundation, you could say, of the soul, or the evolutionary past of the soul, where we came from and what's been built up. The South Node is in Virgo. The practices that have been built up, the skills that have been built up or not, whatever is true, that's what that is. And so we're evolving towards the North Node, which is becoming more conscious. If we become more conscious and aware of what's been built up and what hasn't, we have more agency around what we, around those patterns. And even if they're good patterns for us, it's probably better to be conscious of them, because here's why. Because if they just are, if we just take them for granted, we're not living in love and appreciation. So the more we can become conscious and aware, the more we can live and truly live in love and appreciation for everything that we have. And the more we can change where things aren't going well for us and that are keeping us sort of in a cycle of lack of appreciation, we could say, we have the opportunities to change those things. And I'm speaking to myself here, just to be clear, because I'm living in challenging circumstances, and I have a mental habit of focusing on what's wrong, and I'm not serving myself, Virgo, serving myself that way. And the other thing that I want to talk about here, just something I read in a comment under a YouTube video recently. This person was talking about how they had been living in a situation years ago where it was a challenging situation because people around them were very noisy, and it was really distressing, and they tuned in, and the answer they got about the situation was love them. And so they're like, okay, so they practiced loving them, and they said it wasn't easy at first, but it got easier, and eventually the situation changed for the better. It wasn't that those people changed, but they ended up moving out and new people moved in who were more peaceful. And the thing about that is, in a sense, everybody wins, because loving somebody is not harming them, ever. And it's not working against you, and it's not working against them. It's just love allows the boundaries to shape themselves as they're meant to be shaped and formed, and allows the right energies to come, to each other. So that's another thing. The idea of building the muscle of love, that ultimately what we're trying to do, the idea of practices isn't to, demonstrate that we're doing this thing and that means something about us. The idea of practices is to embody, physically in our bodies, in our minds, love. It's not to say, look, I've done my yoga today, or whatever it is you do. It might be, I've done my CrossFit today, or whatever it is. It's to engage in those practices, like the practices themselves become an expression of love. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so enough about that. So the keen decile. So the keen decile, that is 165 degree aspect, and that, when you count it all out on the wheel, falls at 15 degrees of Virgo. And if you count it backwards on the wheel, it falls at 15 degrees of Libra. So if you imagine the sort of the archetypal opposition as being from 0 degrees of Aries to 0 degrees of Libra, so this line across the middle of the chart, then these keen deciles angle off. So they're like support structures. One way you can think about it, they're like support structures. I think of them as like struts in a car. So as you're going around a bend, the struts prevent the car from falling apart. So the keen deciles are related to these things that seem like they have to do with this pressure, the fatal and the natal, things like that. So it's this idea of pressure. And so I see them as support structures that are designed to keep us intact as we go through these, perhaps the bend or whatever, or in the case of Jupiter in Cancer, where this keen decile is locking in, the idea of birth, going through the birth canal, we're going to experience this squeezing. Actually, I'm saying that differently now. So another perspective is that as we go through the birth canal, the pressure is actually supporting the process. So there's two ways to think about it. The car going around the curve, and it keeps the body of the car intact, but then going through the birth canal, it's this idea of squeezing, and that squeezing is helping us through the canal and also preparing us for the environment, the new environment. We were bathed in fluids in the womb, and then we're moving into an environment where we're breathing air and we're surrounded by air. Entirely different environment. So that squeezing prepares us for the new environment. So 15 degrees of Virgo is about this idea of practice and skill development, and 15 degrees of Libra is about this idea of relationships and balance. So our practices keep us in balance during these pressure times. And so the quality of our practices and the kinds of practices we're engaged in are what are going to make or break us, you could say, through challenging times. And so the practices are really, really important. And it's the more we can become conscious and aware of that, and develop and build appreciation for it, build appreciation for the gifts we've been given. The gifts we've been given, Taurus, the gifts are the foundation for the practices. We take those into Virgo, we develop them through our practices and skill development. The more we can develop appreciation at that level, the more we can develop appreciation for the others who are support people in our lives. We're all support people for one another, right? The more we can develop appreciation, the better these times of pressure will be, if that makes sense. So Jupiter in Cancer, keen decile, Pluto in Aquarius. The other way we can think about this is that Cancer, so Cancer, the birth process, we can think about the water signs, going back to the Grand Trine, as all is having to do with some kind of birth into new developmental levels. So Cancer being about the birth of our bodies and beings in incarnated forms, Scorpio being about the birth of the soul into new levels of development, and Pisces being about the birth of the spirit into new levels of development. So if we can think about water signs as being about birth. And so the keen decile, here we have Jupiter in Cancer, lineage, that really speaks of lineage to me. And here, Pluto in Aquarius, Pluto rules Scorpio. So the evolution of our soul lineages, perhaps, is what this is speaking to. And so what are the practices we inherited? What are the religious beliefs, the philosophies, the ideas, the laws, all of that were handed down to us, that have created the traditions that have formed us? Are those in alignment with love? And perhaps there's something, and we can think about this, by the way, as humanity, not just at our familial lineages, but the lineage of humanity as a general whole. We can think of humanity itself as an organism that is a lineage, right? So there is a lot of stress, we could say, a big ask, you could say, a big turning point, you could say, for humanity around all this. Is this what we want to continue forward? Or do we want to continue forward something else? And what seems to be out of balance, going back to Mars and Libra, is the idea of this idea of take. This idea of leading with take, rather than leading with appreciation, rather than leading with the model of giving and taking, or giving and receiving. So those are the main things. And the idea of the dragnet just goes along with this idea of taking. The idea of the dragnet, it seems to me that culturally this has been in effect for a long time, but it hasn't really affected a lot of us. We haven't really understood it or noticed it. We're like, yeah, it's happening over there, that's not us. But it's really, I think what it is a pattern that's been existing, and it's only inevitable that it's going to come around and start sweeping, all of us up into it. So we have the opportunity at this time to be aware of that and to really start thinking about our practices. AI, for example, beautiful, wonderful aid, but at the same time, there are people who are going out without water because the water is being diverted to take care of the AI, to cool down the AI servers and all that kind of stuff. There is an interesting between Uranus and Mars, there's a sesquiquadrate aspect. That's 135 degrees. It's a square and a half. When you count 135 degrees on the wheel, you get to 15 degrees of Leo, which is the start of the gibbous phase. And Leo is, in some ways, Leo is all about me. I mean, it's a beautiful energy. It's very warm and personable and very, very giving. But there can be this, it's all about me energy to it. Every sign has its shadow. And so this is a turning point, we could say. There is a turning point, perhaps, in our understanding of, our awareness of, and our relationship with AI. And I like to think of this as a developmental shift, that we're learning. We've had all of these experiences. That's all of these. We can think of all of these aspects in the chart. All this energy. We've all been sort of like just madly rushing to AI, and that's not true. Everybody hasn't, but there's been sort of this mad rush to AI with humanity. We've all just adopted it. And again, not we all. I understand that, but many of us have adopted it. And perhaps we're coming to a new level of awakening or awareness about it, and being like, what do we really want our human communities, Uranus, Gemini, what do we really want our human communities to be about? And going back to the idea of a dragnet, the reason the dragnet has been able to work and persist is because it's this idea of strangership. Uranus, stranger in a strange land in a way, in the sense that it rules Aquarius, and in Aquarius we're moving into the unknown. The unknown is unknown to us, and the unknown, and we are unknown to the known. We are unknown to the unknown. So it's this idea of stranger in a strange land. This object, we've created impersonal communities, you could say, or we've created these huge overarching structures, and it's almost like community doesn't really exist anymore, at least in the world that I live in. And so when we don't have direct relationships with people, it's hard to appreciate. It's not that people are not empathic. It's not that people don't care. It's not that people are, whatever. It's that it's happening so far away, it doesn't seem relevant to us. But the dragnet is showing us that it's always been relevant to us. And perhaps I just get the sense that Uranus generally, as it goes through Gemini, one of the things really is going to be about breaking up into smaller communities. We'll all know as we go through it what's really true, but that's what I think. We're certainly seeing some indications that we're heading that way, but what actually happens will be what happens. And so I'm not really predicting anything so much as it makes sense to me that Uranus and Gemini, that's part of what we'll be thinking about, is this idea of communities. And a lot of people are talking about this, so I'm not saying anything revolutionary or anything like that. But so this idea of the sesquiquadrate, there's a developmental shift happening from just sort of this free expression of self to starting to become aware of what's ahead in terms of relationship with others and the need to develop ourselves so that we can be equals in relationship and have services, to offer and give so that we can be equals in relationship. And it's really pretty much the same thing that's being said here, except the idea of apoptosis. So this is the idea of, and perhaps especially with regard to this idea of this sesquiquadrate between Uranus and Mars, that we're awakening to and becoming aware of things in a new way, and that's leading to this falling away of what no longer makes sense to us, and then we can focus in on these aspects. And this T-square especially seems to be about this idea of lineage and what's been passed down from generation to generation, that perhaps is more about this idea of take, and so not about this idea of giving and receiving. So anyway, so it seems like the part of the apoptosis is about really focusing in on this Jupiter in Cancer and this rebalancing of what we pass on, this lineage that keeps getting passed down from one generation to the next. To the extent that that's off kilter, the opportunity is to bring it back into balance. And the thing that can help us is just remembering, especially when you're talking about lineage patterns, that the resistance to change can be enormous. And so you just have to, try to, keep at it. And it's really, really challenging. If you've ever been really, really out of shape and you're going back to fitness practice, it's really challenging to stick with the practice. So part of it is about knowing where your developmental level is, and if we're thinking about physical training practice, part of it is knowing where you are and where to step in. So it's hard to sustain a practice when you're stepping in further along than you really are, and it's hard to sustain a practice when you're stepping in a place that's not challenging enough for where you are. You have to find that sweet spot. And that, by the way, is the other thing. This is what I'll end with. That's the other thing I wanted to say about this keen decile. The whole reason I was talking about the opposition and the keen decile angling off, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the idea of the path, right? So the opposition we can think about as the path. And then the challenge is to stay on the path. But there's the left side of the path and the right side of the path, and that doesn't mean anything. It's just we can go off one way or another way. There are ways that we can fall off the path, and the challenge is staying on the path. And when times are challenging, as the energies in this chart suggest, perhaps we'll be facing those. Then the challenge is, do we have the practices in place that will allow us to stay on the path? In the Bible, they say something like, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than to get into heaven, or something like that. If we think about heaven as the path that we're walking, are we walking on the path? That would be heaven. Or do we keep falling off? Is it hard for us to stay on that path? So again, the idea that to the extent that we're going through challenging times, the opportunity available to us is to engage in practices. And even if we have no practices and have no idea what we're doing, perhaps we can start to think about what would be good practices for us. And if I have to, given that I'm struggling with these times, what might be practices that would help me through this and that I can develop so that if I meet these kinds of experiences or whatever again, they will be easier for me. So I hope there was something helpful for you there. I think that's everything I have to say. I'm speaking to myself as much as I am to you whenever I do these, but especially when it comes to the idea of practices, because I definitely have practices in place that are not serving me very well. And so this is one of those areas for me. And part of the issue is like, what practices do I do? And there are all sorts of practices, but I'm like, no, not that one, not that one, not that one, not that one. And so this is a really challenging area for me. And so I'll be working on it as much as all of you are. Okay, so that is what I have to say. Take what works and leave the rest. If it is helpful for you, that is what you take. If it's not helpful for you, that is what you leave. The important thing is that you tune into what is helpful for you and what supports you on your journey. Nothing else matters other than that. So anyway, if you like this, please like it. It's inspiring for me when people like it. It keeps me going. You can always subscribe. Also, if you're not subscribed, you can subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe there. If you're watching it on Substack, you can subscribe there. Substack is really the main place. I sometimes add additional thoughts in the show notes, and we'll sometimes post other things. So that's the best place to keep up to date. If you want to support Astrology Journal and me with money at a paid level, you can do that. You can subscribe on Substack. So I will leave it there. I appreciate your support. I appreciate your watching this and tuning in at whatever level you're doing that. So thank you for that. And I will leave it there. Okay, take care. Bye.